There is a daughter I mother, a daughter I love. But she is not mine, and I am not hers forever. There's a mother she loves, and a mother who loves her forever. For love is like water. No human border can keep it out. Yes, love is like water. It moves above in the clouds and below in the soil. Love is water. In February of 2018, I became a foster mom to a 5-year-old Honduran girl, Julia, and she had been labeled unaccompanied when she came into the United States. But she wasn't actually unaccompanied. She traveled with her biological mother and her stepdad, Lupe and Carlos. They made their journey up from Honduras through Guatemala into Mexico and attempted to get into the United States. They were at the mercy of the smugglers that they paid $7,500 to. They came for economic opportunity. Julia's great-grandfather was sick, and Lupe had spent the family savings for his medical care. Lupe had lived in other regions of Honduras as a way to try to get enough money to pay for this medicine. But she needed more. So she thought a way that she could do this would be to come to the United States, stay for a couple of months, get a decent job, and send the money that they needed back home. Her intention was not to stay. Her intention was to get enough money and go back home. A friend connected her to the smuggler that same friend had used to come up from Honduras and into the United States. The friend didn't have any issues, but Lupe's fate was not the same. On the trip through Mexico, the group that Carlos and Lupe and Julia had traveled with would stop along the way. And usually those stops would be near nightclubs that the smugglers had connections to. And there were certain women in the group who were chosen to be prostituted out in those nightclubs. They made good money off of Lupe. So at the last stop in northern Mexico, the smugglers took Lupe as a hostage. Julia and Carlos were able to cross the Rio Bravo or the Rio Grande, depending on which side you live on. They were able to cross over. But Lupe stayed behind, and she was exploited sexually. It's unclear why Customs and Border Protection decided to separate Julia and Carlos, but most likely it was because of the zero-tolerance policy that was happening at that time. So Julia was then placed into a sponsorship family through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. She was officially unaccompanied. Carlos was deported, and Julia was alone. She ended up going to Carlos's sister's family and stayed there, and that family lived in North Carolina, in the same county that my family lived in. Around the same time that Lupe and her family began their journey in October of 2017, we also began a journey as a family into foster care. The first month was total and utter chaos. And any of the foster parents in the room, you can say amen. Make me not feel so bad. We ended up getting 2 foster daughters placed with us, and we also have 2 biological children. So we went from a family of 4 to a family of 6 pretty quick in foster terms, 2 days. And so everything was different. All of a sudden, in our own home, in our own space, everything was different. Mealtime was tricky. Teaching the girls to eat using napkins, discovering what they liked to eat, what they didn't like to eat, and trying to figure out how to begin some healthy patterns of eating was really quite difficult. Bath time was also tricky, keeping private parts behind closed doors, not knowing if there was any abuse associated with this, trying to figure out the logistics of getting 4 children bathed before bedtime. Usually, we gave the youngest girls a bath first, so 2 youngest girls got a bath first. When they were done, the eldest girl got a shower, and then after all of the girls were dressed, then our son went in and he took his shower. It was a whole ordeal that literally started right after supper and ended right before bed. Bedtime was also tricky. Brushing teeth thoroughly every night was a new routine. Sitting still to read a book was not normal. Finding books that piqued the girls' interest but didn't talk too much about mommies and daddies for the sake of sadness was tricky. We taught them Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and the ABC song, which to our annoyance they absolutely loved and wouldn't stop singing. Then it was time for prayers and goodnight kisses. And those first 2 weeks, we had to walk out of the room, close the door, and let these 2 precious girls cry themselves to sleep. I wasn't prepared for that. They didn't teach us that in MAP class. It was heartbreaking. Oftentimes it would keep our son and daughter awake as the home had very little insulation in it. Why are they crying so much? Our son would ask. So we would try to have him imagine what it would be like to leave his home, to leave his culture that exists inside the home, suddenly enter a new place where all the rules were different and all the food was different. Transportation was also very tricky. Getting the eldest girl to school was complicated because the school was far away from our home. Picking up all the kids on time was completely impossible for one parent to do, so work hours suffered. We were completely and utterly exhausted. Our social workers knew our family spoke Spanish, so a few months later, when a little Spanish-speaking girl showed up at their office, that's Julia, due to neglect from her sponsorship family, they called us. They said, "It's just going to be the weekend. Federal agents are going to come on Monday. She's going to go back into ICE custody. It's just going to be the weekend." My husband knew not to believe that. I was duped and thought it was just going to be for the weekend. But it turned into 4 months, and it was a challenging 4 months for sure. About the same time that Julia came back to live with us, her mom, Lupe, about a week before, had just returned to Honduras. She had escaped the smugglers, gone into Mexican immigration custody, and they brought her back to Honduras. By the time we made contact with Lupe, it was very clear to the social workers and to us that the two needed to be reunited. But getting all the paperwork ready and the right documents signed by the right people in power was not easy. This was a very unique scenario for our county. It felt like a case of immigration, but because she was in state custody as a foster child, a foster placement, we had to go through the same foster care protocol. So we had to get a home study done in Honduras. And in order to do that, we had to get the consulate involved. We then had to have the judge in North Carolina sign off on them being allowed to be reunified. And then we had to get the consulate to give us paperwork to bring with her back to her home country, because she couldn't travel without any documents. But finally, in July of 2018, my husband Andrew and I traveled with Julia back to Honduras. At the airport, when Julia saw her mother, she ran shaking through the automatic doors. Lupe scooped her up, and Julia laid her head on her mother's shoulder. The two of them wept. 8 months apart. Was 8 months too long? It was a really beautiful and heartening reunification. By the time we got to their home, there was a whole ordeal, a huge Elsa-themed welcome home party for little Julia. And if you don't know who Elsa is, there's a new movie out. You have no excuse. In a lot of ways, Lupe and Julia were lucky. During the second half of their separation, they got to video chat with each other. They knew where each other was. They knew where they were going, that they were going to be reunited, even though they didn't know exactly when that was going to happen. Julia never questioned if Lupe still loved her. But it feels completely unfair for me, a mother who's never been forcibly separated from her daughter, to even use that word, lucky, to describe the situation. Reports have shown that 5,460 children were separated forcibly during the zero tolerance policy that actually started in July 2017 and went until June 2018. Child separation has been a tactic used prior to the current administration, but it was on full display and on large scale during that zero tolerance policy. In the majority of these situations, the parents did not know where the child was sent off to. They didn't know if the child went to a facility or to a foster care home. They didn't know. Additionally, the administration didn't know how to track to keep them together when it was time to reunite. So it was quite a process. I talked in the beginning about how love is like water. And no human border can keep love out. But there are things that taint the water. Toxic stress, disruption of brain development, PTSD, increased anxiety, increased fear, feelings of abandonment, inconsolable crying, breakdown of family trust, physical pain as a manifestation of mental trauma, difficulty sleeping, learning, forming relationships, suicide, and attempts of suicide. These are all ways that love has been contaminated by a source that shouldn't have access to it. In some situations, children in these cases have been known to say things like, "My chest hurts. I can't feel my heart. Every heartbeat hurts." Bodies are beaten and broken when parents try to cross this border, trying to bring life to the lives they brought into this world. And as Christians, this should sound very familiar to us, because we serve a king whose body was broken as he brought life and light into this world. We have to look at the holy ground of our southern border. We have to look at the holy ground of migration patterns. And we have to look at our own theology and try to better understand, how does it deal with this? What does our theology say to situations like this? And I think one of the deepest questions we really have to ask ourselves is, what do we believe a human being is? If our theology says that human beings are only their souls, then we can justify anything that we do to the bodies of our neighbors. We can justify anything that's done to the mental health of our neighbors, because it doesn't matter. Only our souls matter. See, if we concern ourselves only with eternal salvation, then we can become complicit in dehumanization. It's happened all throughout our history, and it's still happening today. And if our theology says that human beings are only their economic worth, then we dehumanize our neighbors in the same way the smugglers were dehumanizing Lupe. It looks different, but it's the same foundation. And we also dehumanize ourselves because we filter the world through a mentality of scarcity. We, the followers of the God of communal abundance, remember this Old Testament teachings? We're the followers of the God of Jubilee. But we suddenly decide there's not enough to go around. That's not a theology that is robust enough to handle these situations. The good news, the whole gospel, says that there's enough. There is overflow at the banqueting table. In Luke 4, Jesus reads a passage from Isaiah and gives us insight into why he came. It's one of my favorite passages. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners, and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The year of the Lord's favor was a reference to the year of Jubilee. And Jubilee was a time after 49 years where fields and vineyards were to be left fallow. Indentured servants were to be set free, and land was to be returned to its original owner. The point of all of this was to remind the Israelites that the earth was the Lord's and the fullness thereof, just like Psalm 24 says. It was a reminder that God is the God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, just like Psalm 50 says. It was a reminder that God is a God of abundance, just like John 10 says. You see, I'm convinced that the America that we live in requires a mentality of scarcity to continue, so the status quo continues. It requires us to believe there's not enough to go around. And I think the gospel speaks directly to that. The culture tells us there's a finite amount of power, of land, of privilege, of good opportunity, of spots at the best schools. But a mentality of abundance flips all of that around. And in order to see that, we have to start defining things differently. What is power? What is privilege? What is opportunity? The scarcity mentality demands us to dehumanize our neighbors and ourselves. What if we really believed that God is a God of abundance? What if we really believed that my flourishing is based not on how much higher I can get than you, but how high we can get together? What if we defined opportunity that way? I think the world tells us that life is a game of musical chairs. And if you don't get a seat, you don't get to play. But that's not what the gospel says. Because in that situation, if you don't get a seat, you lose. But when we look at Christ's life, if we define it the same way of that musical chairs, then Christ was a giant loser. And that's how we're defining our lives. That's how we're defining power and privilege and opportunity. It's certainly not by the standard that Christ set for us, because his body was broken to bring life and light into this world. He fought against the mentality of scarcity. He says in John 10, "The thief comes only to kill, steal, and destroy, but I have come to bring life and life more abundant. Abundance restores our humanity. It reminds us that we are all broken human beings. We are all called to seek the flourishing of our neighbors, regardless of what that neighbor's identity is. Because neighboring is mutual. And that's something that I think we've lost in our society, this idea of mutuality. When I'm not flourishing, I need neighbors who seek my flourishing. And when my neighbor is not flourishing, I need to be the neighbor that seeks their flourishing. At the Last Supper, Christ took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples. And he said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took the cup of wine and said, "This is the blood of the covenant which is poured out for many, the forgiveness of sins." When we do this, we remember that Christ's body was broken for our nourishment. His blood was poured out for our nourishment, for our flourishing. When Christ is our banquet, there's enough. There's overflow. Yes, love is water. Love is living water. And you and me and all of our neighbors are all thirsty for that living water. Because we are all human beings and we all thirst. So let's give Christ to each other and remember that he is enough.